Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. I haven't been talking with you, my dear listeners, for quite some time as the war was going on and there was no clarity as to what's happening, and there's no more clarity now. But I've been working on a book, Russian History from Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin. And here are a few of the comparisons that came to mind when I compare these two leaders of Russia in historical perspective. The interesting thing is that both Lenin and Putin have put a challenge to the Western world. Lenin has created a communist international that challenged the Western world for most of the 20th century. Lenin saw Russia as a center of resistance to Western capitalism and created a center of political, cultural, economic counterbalance to the Western world, believing that the day would come of the proletarian revolution that would overthrow capitalist order. Putin, on the other hand, has also created a kind of a counterbalance to the Western world. He threw a challenge to the Western world in that Russia is positioning itself under Putin as a major opponent to Western world, both militarily, economically, politically, and morally. Both at the time of Lenin and at the time of Putin now, Russia has actually been facing the West militarily. Many of you probably read my book on the Russian Civil War, which shows that in February 1919, the British and the French sent expeditionary forces that landed in Odessa and in Archangel and in Vladivostok, and then they actually took part themselves in the fighting of the Bolsheviks, especially in Ukraine in 1919. And then they provided massive military aid to Bolsheviks' opponents, the Whites, General Denikin and Admiral Kolchak. And of course now very similar things are going on, which is the West is arming a government of Ukraine that positioned itself as a major threat to Putin through the positioning of NATO forces in Ukraine. So both leaders have had to face militarily the Western powers. Now, at the same time, there's a significant difference between the two because Lenin didn't regard Russia as valuable in itself. Russia was for him a launching pad for a war on Western capitalism. Russia was supposed to be an example for others to follow, but Russia as such was not of any value to Lenin. He could have, if successful, could have launched a proletarian revolution anywhere else. It just so happened that it was Russia. So for Russian nationalism was totally alien to Lenin. For him, internationalism was very important, and therefore he pursued the policy of what he wrote into the Russian constitution, which is self-determination up to secession. And that made possible for the Soviet Union to have this very strange constitution where each republic had a legal right to secede from the Soviet Union. In my previous videos, I discussed what Lenin thought about nationalities and how Stalin implemented it, and Putin criticized Lenin and considered that one of his major mistakes in that he created the kind of constitution that basically made the Soviet Union de jure a confederation where each part could leave. And therefore, Putin, I argue, regarded his mission to correct the mistakes of Lenin and then of Stalin by essentially reassembling the lands that used to belong to the Russian Empire and then to the Soviet Union. And now that the Ukrainian government has chosen to ally itself with NATO, Putin sees as his major historical objective is to put an opposition to the expansion of NATO into the territories of the former Soviet Union. Now, the differences go even further than that. Lenin both and Putin and Lenin both challenged the West not only politically, not only in terms of economic system, but also morally, in terms of the moral values. Now, Lenin, of course, created some kind of a proletarian culture, proletarian identity, proletarian worldview. All of that was, of course, total nonsense, because it was just that the Russian intelligentsia that followed Lenin created these fake proletarian identity and proletarian culture that didn't exist. It was something that they wanted to create and project it onto the working class, which had its own normal, traditional family values, even very kind of domineering for men over women, and it's very, very traditional. And most of the what so-called socialist proletarian values were simply pipe dream that the Bolshevik intellectuals invented. Now, if we talk about morality and moral values, what Putin pursues, that is quite more serious. In one of his speeches, and I also have a video on that, he criticizes the West woke culture, which he totally opposes it. He's talking about the West is moving in the wrong direction, with parent one, parent two, instead of mother and father, with women and men changing sex if they want to, with men marrying men, women marrying women, and all the other achievements of the Western civilization, which is totally unacceptable to the majority of Russians. And that is what Putin is playing up to by saying that Russia favors family values, religion, and conservative traditional family. One man, one woman, that's it. Another thing that he also criticized in the West is their censorship and the closing down of Twitter accounts and the confiscation of private property. In other words, the West, from Putin's point of view, has completely betrayed its own principles on family, private property, and religion, and it is Russia that is keeping those values. And in that sense, from Putin's point of view, he is creating a kind of a moral opposition to Western civilization. The reason that is important is that Putin, like Lenin, but in many different ways, has created himself an image of a person who leads Russia in opposition to the West. For the first time, this is what I said in my previous videos, and this is crucial. For the first time, ever since Peter the Great, Russia no longer wants to emulate the West. Throughout Russian history, Russia wanted to be like the West. Even Lenin thought Russia as a leader of the West to follow, but still remaining the Western civilization as a part of the liberation from capitalism, moving on further to socialism. Now, Putin, what is saying is that we don't need that. We don't need the gay marriages. We don't need abandonment of religion. We don't need abandonment of principle of private property when it could be confiscated for people's political views under the banner of so-called democracy. So in a sense, there's also another very interesting aspect of Putin's critique in that the kind of philosophers that he values put much more emphasis on nationalist or national prosperity than on democracy per se. In other words, democracy is good when it serves the people to achieve its maximum potential, but it's not good if it's in the hands of some to put it mildly, incapable leaders who don't know what they're doing, and in the end could do more harm to the country than authoritarian leadership. So there's a kind of a revision of that too. Now, this is about the moral challenge. Now, also, let's just look at the military challenge. Now, the Western media is saying Russia is not doing so well in this war, and the Ukrainians keep dreaming that they're going to win, and then they win back Donbass and force the people of Donbass to be in Ukraine and force Russian-speaking people in Crimea to be in Ukraine. All this is going on, and the West supports all these claims. Now, what's interesting to note is that, of course, nobody knows which way it's going to go. But the data is that as of now, Ukrainian side has suffered catastrophic casualties, about 150,000. And nobody in the West really cares about Ukraine or about Ukrainian casualties. But just imagine what would happen if these were American lives, if America lost 150,000 of its soldiers trying to fight Putin in Ukraine. I don't think American people would stand for it. And that means that militarily, Putin has created a very, very serious challenge to the West. Now, it's also important to note that Russia is only a country of 148 million people, and the United States is 300 million people and more, and there's another 500 million in the European Union, and all of them are helping Ukraine, but rather to say the nationalist government in Ukraine. In other words, Putin has an uphill battle, and therefore there are all these projections as to what may happen in the future. Now, it's interesting that the universal Western perception is that Putin is bad, Putin is a dictator, is really a pejorative word. Not so for Russians. 78% of Russians today support President Putin, and that's higher than it's been in many leading countries of their own leaders that are hovering about 20 or 30%. For Macron or for Scholz or even for President Biden. So one can say, sure, Russian people do support Putin. Whether the West likes it or not, they do support Putin. Moreover, Western support for so-called Western liberals have only discredited them, because when these people now are saying that they would like Navalny, the Russian pundits are saying, would Navalny invite NATO to Kharkiv? Would he want to station American bases in parts of Ukraine to threaten Russia? If they say yes, that's what he's going to do, then of course no Russian would ever do it. If he says no, then he is not acceptable to the West, because the West wants only those leaders, liberals in Russia, who welcome expansion of NATO and expansion of Western influence over Russia. In other words, from that point of view, if the West succeeds, then Russia would lose, in the opinion of most Russian pundits, observers, intellectuals, etc. So let me just finish on the final comparison between the two. Both of them have positioned themselves to oppose the West. If Putin loses, then Russia may be forced to resort to ultimate defense. If Putin loses, if Ukrainians advance to even beyond what they consider their territory, it's a dangerous situation when Russian military doctrine says that if they are losing, they may resort to nuclear weapons. And the Western media keeps saying it's going to be against Ukraine. No, Russians are never going to use nuclear weapons on Ukraine, which they consider to be a part of historical Russia. It would be against the West. So to defeat Putin is extremely dangerous for the world and for the West. If Putin wins, and that would mean essentially establishing Russian control over Donbass or over Novorossiya, eastern Ukraine, or maybe even in Kiev, that would make him probably the most successful Russian leader in history. And then would be a very interesting thing what the West would do in this situation. Would they start a nuclear war, or would they have to live with victorious Putin? Thank you very much, and I hope to resume regular comments on current politics and historical events. Please subscribe. Bye-bye. Till next time.